Imagine being told that your marriage was already decided before you were old enough to understand what marriage meant. Your father had negotiated the agreement. Your family had calculated the wealth. A king might have chosen your spouse to secure an alliance. A law might determine what happened to your body if you were accused of adultery. And in some societies, marriage could mean something even stranger. You might be expected to marry a relative to preserve a royal bloodline. You might enter a household where your husband already had several concubines. You might be blamed for infertility even when the problem was not yours. And if your marriage collapsed, the consequences could be written into law, sometimes with punishments severe enough to cost someone their life. The ancient world did not have one idea of marriage. It had hundreds. For some people, marriage meant companionship, family, property, and even genuine affection. For others, it was an economic transaction, a political weapon, or a mechanism for controlling inheritance and female sexuality. And behind the wedding ceremonies, jewelry, feasts, and promises was a much darker question. Who actually had the power to decide whom you married? Because once we look beyond the romantic image of the ancient wedding, we discover a world where marriage could determine your wealth, your children, your social status, and sometimes, your survival. But what really happened? More than 3,700 years ago, in the cities of ancient Mesopotamia, marriage was not simply a private relationship. It was an economic and legal institution. The famous Code of Hammurabi, produced during the reign of Babylonian King Hammurabi in the 18th century BCE, contained hundreds of laws governing property, inheritance, divorce, adultery, and family relationships. It was not the world's first law code, but it is one of the best preserved and most famous. Imagine living in Babylon and discovering that the most intimate parts of your marriage could become matters for a court. Marriage agreements could involve property and financial arrangements. Divorce was possible, but it carried consequences. A husband could divorce his wife, while women could also have grounds for leaving a marriage in certain circumstances. But adultery was different. The ancient Babylonian legal system treated sexual infidelity as a threat to the household and, more importantly, to legitimate inheritance. And this created an extraordinary imbalance. A woman's sexual behavior could become a legal issue because society needed certainty about the identity of a child's father. One of Hammurabi's laws describes a married woman accused of an affair being subjected to an ordeal involving the river. The logic was terrifyingly simple. The gods, people believed, could reveal the truth. If she survived, she could be considered innocent. If she did not, the river had supposedly delivered judgment. But there was an even darker detail. Under some circumstances, the husband could decide whether his wife lived. The law was not merely about morality. It was about authority. And that tells us something important about ancient marriage. What looked like a private betrayal could be treated as a crime against the structure of the family itself. But that wasn't the whole story. Because Babylonian husbands who wanted children had another option. If a wife could not produce children, a husband could sometimes take a concubine. The continuation of the family line was considered so important that infertility could transform the structure of the household. And notice the assumption hidden inside this system. The problem was often placed on the woman. Ancient societies did not possess modern knowledge of reproductive biology. So a childless marriage could become a source of suspicion, blame, and humiliation. Marriage was not simply about two people. It was about producing heirs. And whoever controlled the heirs controlled the future. Several centuries later, in the Assyrian world, the laws surrounding women could become even more severe. The Middle Assyrian laws, preserved on clay tablets from roughly the 2nd millennium BCE, contain regulations dealing with marriage, sexuality, assault, and women's behavior. Some of these laws reveal an intensely patriarchal society in which a woman's relationship with a man could carry enormous legal consequences. The laws did not treat all sexual offenses equally. Status mattered. Whether the woman was married mattered. Whether the man was a stranger, a husband, or someone from another household mattered. And punishment could be brutal. Yet there is an important warning here. Ancient legal codes are not necessarily descriptions of everyday life. They tell us what authorities considered punishable, not how frequently every punishment actually occurred. That distinction matters. Historians cannot simply read a law saying something happened and conclude that it happened routinely. But the existence of these laws still reveals something profound. The state was increasingly interested in regulating the boundaries of marriage. Because marriage meant inheritance. Inheritance meant property. Property meant power. And power was something ancient governments desperately wanted to control. Now travel west. Picture Athens. White marble buildings rise above the city. Philosophers debate politics in public spaces. Citizens discuss democracy. But inside the household, the picture looks very different. For an Athenian woman, marriage was generally arranged through her male guardian, known as the Kyrios. The legal system did not normally require the woman's own consent in the same way modern marriage does. Her father or another male guardian arranged the transfer. And dowry was central to the process. A young woman could be married in her early teens, while her husband was often considerably older. The marriage joined families, transferred property, established legitimate children, and strengthened social connections. Romance might come later. Or it might never come at all. Ancient sources also reveal another striking inequality. A respectable married woman was expected to maintain sexual fidelity. But elite Greek men could have sexual relationships outside marriage, including with concubines. A man could have a wife and a concubine simultaneously, although the children of the concubine did not necessarily enjoy the same legitimate status. So marriage did not necessarily mean sexual exclusivity for both partners. It could mean one set of expectations for the wife and another for the husband. And the consequences went beyond the bedroom. The legitimacy of children determined inheritance and citizenship. In Athens, marriage itself was therefore connected to one of the most powerful questions in the ancient city. Who belongs to the community? But then Rome took the idea of family authority to another level. Roman marriage was complicated. There was no single form of Roman marriage that remained unchanged for centuries. One of the most important distinctions was between marriages cum manu and sine manu. In a manus marriage, a woman could come under the legal authority of her husband, effectively entering his family under a relationship resembling the authority a father exercised over a daughter. In a sine manu marriage, she remained legally connected to her birth family instead. That sounds like a technical legal distinction. It wasn't. It could affect property, inheritance, and family authority. The Roman family was headed by the pater familias, the senior male head of the household. His authority could be extraordinary. Cambridge scholarship describes the early Roman family as a structure in which the pater familias possessed extensive legal power over descendants. Marriage therefore did not simply unite a man and woman. It rearranged the architecture of an entire family. And then there was the dowry. For wealthy Romans, dowries could involve enormous amounts of property, including land, slaves, household goods, or money. A marriage could therefore become a financial negotiation between powerful families. And when that marriage ended, the money could become a battlefield. In some forms of marriage, the dowry had to be returned, potentially placing serious financial pressure on the husband's family. But Rome also reveals something historians must be careful about. Ancient wedding ceremonies are often reconstructed from elite male literary sources. Modern historian Karen Hirsch has emphasized that the evidence is incomplete and that historians cannot simply assume that the literary description of a Roman wedding perfectly represented the experience of every bride. So even when the surviving evidence looks precise, the lived reality may remain hidden. And sometimes that uncertainty makes the history more haunting. Because the people who experienced these marriages rarely left us their own voices. Then comes one of the most famous and most misunderstood marriage customs of the ancient world. Royal sibling marriage in Egypt. Pharaohs sometimes married close relatives, including sisters or half-sisters. Tutankhamun, for example, was married to Enkhesinemun, who was his half-sister. Hatshepsut married her half-brother Thutmose II. To modern eyes, this is shocking. But the royal logic was different. Egyptian kingship was deeply connected to religion. The gods themselves were sometimes portrayed as married siblings, most famously Osiris and Isis. For certain royal dynasties, marrying within the family could reinforce the sacred character of kingship and keep power concentrated inside the ruling house. But here's where history gets complicated. The idea that all ancient Egyptians routinely practiced sibling marriage is false. Evidence suggests that royal closekin marriages occurred, while ordinary Egyptian society generally followed different patterns. And in Roman Egypt, centuries later, papyrus census records provide unusually strong evidence for brother-sister marriages among some non-royal populations. One major study found that 23.5% of documented marriages in the Arsinoides district sample were between brothers and sisters, with especially high recorded rates in the city of Arsino during the 2nd century CE. That discovery overturned the simplistic idea that sibling marriage was exclusively a royal phenomenon. But historians still debate exactly why it became relatively common in some Roman Egyptian communities. And then there is another mystery. Egyptian royal inscriptions sometimes use words such as brother and sister in ways that may not always indicate literal biological relationships. So when an ancient inscription calls a queen the king's sister, historians must examine the wider evidence before assuming a biological sibling marriage. The darker truth is not that every Egyptian practiced incest. It is that marriage could be used to turn bloodline itself into a political institution. Far to the east, ancient Chinese societies developed another powerful marriage system. Marriage was often negotiated between families. Professional matchmakers could become involved. Social status, economic interests, family reputation, and even astrology could influence the selection. In some cases, engagements were arranged when children were still very young. The bride then entered the household of her husband's family. And that transition represented far more than moving into a new home. It could mean transferring her labor, fertility, loyalty, and domestic responsibilities from one family to another. The marriage was therefore also an alliance between lineages. But perhaps the darkest part was what happened inside wealthy households. A man might have a primary wife and multiple concubines. Concubines occupied a lower legal and social position than wives, and one important function was to provide additional children, particularly sons, when the primary wife did not produce a male heir. For the wife, this could create an extraordinary emotional and social competition. She was expected to maintain harmony inside the household while another woman might be brought into the same family for the purpose of producing children. Yet even here, historians caution against painting every ancient Chinese woman as powerless. Qin and Han legal documents have revealed that some women possessed considerably more legal autonomy than earlier scholarship assumed, including circumstances in which widows and wives could exercise meaningful legal authority. Again, the ancient world refuses to fit neatly into a single story. Marriage could be oppressive. But individual women could also find ways to negotiate the system. Across these civilizations, the details were different. Babylon had marriage contracts and severe adultery laws. Assyria regulated sexuality through harsh legal punishments. Athens transferred a woman between male-controlled households. Rome used marriage to reorganize family authority and property. Egyptian royalty sometimes turned closekin marriage into an instrument of dynastic power. China built marriage around family alliances and permitted elite men to maintain concubines. But underneath all of them was a common theme. Marriage was rarely only about love. It was about control. Control of property. Control of inheritance. Control of legitimate children. Control of alliances. And, above all, control of the future. That is why ancient marriage laws could become so severe. A marriage was the foundation of the household. The household was the foundation of inheritance. Inheritance was the foundation of political power. So when a society controlled marriage, it was not merely controlling romance. It was controlling society itself. And perhaps the most disturbing part is that the ancient people who lived under these systems did not necessarily see them as strange. To them, these customs could be normal, sacred, necessary, even honorable. That is one of the hardest lessons of history. People rarely believe they are living inside the past. They believe they are living inside reality. There is another reason these stories feel so dark. Most of the surviving evidence was produced by people with power. Kings, officials, lawmakers, priests, wealthy families, male writers. Clay tablets survived. Legal codes survived. Tomb inscriptions survived. But the private thoughts of the young woman whose father arranged her marriage? Often gone. The fear of a bride entering a household where she had never met her husband? Usually invisible. The feelings of a concubine entering a wealthy family? Rarely preserved. The emotions of a man forced into a political marriage? Almost impossible to reconstruct. This is where responsible history matters. We cannot invent their feelings. We cannot claim every arranged marriage was miserable. We cannot claim every ancient woman was helpless. And we cannot romanticize systems simply because they were traditional. The evidence shows something more complicated. Some ancient marriages were genuinely affectionate. Egyptian tomb paintings and love poetry preserve evidence of emotional attachment between husbands and wives. Roman marriage rituals could involve religion, family, community, and genuine consent. Some women possessed property and legal rights that might surprise us today. But alongside these realities existed systems that could place marriage, sexuality, and inheritance under extraordinary social control. And that contradiction is perhaps the most fascinating part of the story. Thousands of years have passed since the laws of Babylon were carved into stone. The Roman household disappeared. The great dynasties of Egypt collapsed. The ancient Chinese kingdoms transformed into new empires. Their temples became ruins. Their palaces became archaeological sites. But marriage survived. And the ancient struggle over who gets to choose a spouse, who controls property, who inherits wealth, and what society expects from husbands and wives never completely disappeared. The customs changed. The arguments changed. The laws changed. But the question remained. How much of a person's life should society be allowed to decide? And when we look back at these ancient marriages, perhaps the most important question is not which civilization had the darkest custom. It is this. If you had been born into one of these societies, would you have recognized the injustice, or would you simply have accepted it as normal? Because history's darkest customs were rarely frightening to the people who invented them. They were simply the rules of their world. And sometimes, the most disturbing thing about the ancient world is realizing how easily human beings can learn to call control tradition.